Welcome back. I am lucky to have with me today Dr. Alyssa Kushner, who is a friend. I have these amazing friends and colleagues who have been gracious enough and kind enough to join us on our podcast to teach us more and more and more about perinatal and reproductive mental health. And Dr. Kushner is going to talk to us today with a strong emphasis and focus on perinatal OCD or OCD in general. And I hope that we're going to also touch a little bit upon scrupulosity, and we'll introduce that term a little bit later. But before we launch into the content, Dr. Kushner, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Alyssa Kushner, and I am a psychologist in Philadelphia. I work at the Corporal Michael J. Crescenz VA Medical Center, and there I am the assistant director of the internship training program. I also participate in national training programs for depression and suicide safety planning. In addition to that, before I came to the VA, I was working at the Center for the Treatment and Study of Anxiety at the University of Pennsylvania. And so there, my primary role was really focusing on the treatment of OCD and anxiety disorders, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I've also carried those skills with me into the VA. I also have a private practice that is focused on treating specifically anxiety disorders and OCD.
Wow. And I think about, like, when I always think about training, I think about the VA being the premier training location. To me, I feel like it's a unique population, but also one that it has a lot of needs and significant learning opportunities. Has that been your experience in working at the VA?
Definitely. I was not fortunate enough. I didn't think about it at the time when I was back in graduate school, but really most folks in medical professions, including in behavioral health, have passed through the VA at some point during their training programs. I did not, because I was doing more specialized treatment in anxiety disorders, but I really missed the opportunity to work with this special population. And in coming to the VA, it's really just such a wonderful place to train. There are so many needs within behavioral health. Our behavioral health department is gigantic, which is
Yeah.
wonderful because it means that we can really provide a breadth of experiences to our veterans, and also just a wealth of training opportunities. So our APA accredited training program, I believe we are currently in our, I want to say 12th year,
Wow.
and we are interviewing for our next class starting next week. So the
Amazing.
process is always going around.
Amazing. And the Center for Anxiety that you referred to in your training that's like Edna Foa's group, isn't that through
That's
University of
right.
Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I
Right.
was at Edna Foa's clinic. I was there for several years. And while I was in graduate school, I also was at Jonathan Grayson's clinic for a couple of
Oh,
years
wow.
working in OCD. Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
so you
wow.
clearly
Okay.
recognize Jonathan Grayson's name,
Clearly.
and he is
Yes.
one of the premier experts in the treatment of OCD as well. And he was really a lot of fun to train with.
How fabulous. How fabulous. So talk to me about, like, especially in the work that you're doing in the VA perspective. I'm just curious, before we launch into the broader community, what is your percentages between male and female when you're working with, the clients and the patients that are either inpatient or outpatient treatment? VA historically, our military community has been significantly male, more so than female, but has that been shifting? Or I'm curious about the accessing of care nowadays between the men and the women that are serving. What have you noticed?
Yeah, so even in the time that I've been there, I've now been at the VA for 14 years. Sorry, 13, don't want to misrepresent myself. Just had a 13-year anniversary. And so in the 13 years that I've been there, I've really seen a greater outreach to females in our military population. We have a women's health center. They have really kind of their own area within our actual medical center. So like a physical space that's really just for women, which is wonderful because unfortunately within the VA system and within the military, there's also a lot of sexual harassment that happens. And so having a really separate space that they can access where they can get the care that they need, mostly by female providers, I think has really been a game changer in terms of encouraging our female veterans to come in and access the care that they need. We also, within our behavioral health clinic, have a women's health team that really helps to provide they do the intakes, they provide the referrals to the appropriate levels of care within our clinic to make sure that our female veterans can access the services. So that's also really nice. I feel like that's definitely started in the time that I've been at the VA. We do treat a greater number of males within our clinic, just because of the imbalance in terms of what the population looks like, and the fact that at the VA, most of our population is an aging population, which means that was still a time where the military was largely male in population, but we have plenty of females as well.
And do you feel like you're noticing a shift in the willingness to access behavioral health needs and mental health care?
Within the VA, it's always been really interesting because there's also an aspect of many of our veterans are able to access financially from the VA system for service-connected illnesses or injuries, things that happened to them while they were in the military, which means also that we're talking about mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, which most often for males happens at the prime ages where people are in the military. So it doesn't mean necessarily that the military is what caused their bipolar disorder, but it does mean that their bipolar disorder really came out while they were serving in the military, which means that now the VA is responsible for providing compensation in the long term. So there is some benefit. There's some financial potential gain that can come from veterans also accessing care that they need within the health system, which is where I work. My primary function is getting people to want to access care for their own personal gain and betterment, right? Wanting them to be able to lead more successful lives after having been able to access their mental health treatment. So, try not to focus as much on the financial aspect of things because that's outside of my purview, but really encouraging people to be able to think about the potential benefits of what it would look like if their quality of life could improve.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Okay. I feel like we could do a whole conversation around the military. Maybe we will another day, but let's shift gears and let's talk OCD specifically. And as we've chosen that to be the topic of our conversation today, let's start with the basics. Obsessive compulsive disorder. We know it's in our diagnostic manual, our DSM-5. Talk to me as a therapist, but also to the population, because the general population, what is OCD and how are we, kind of, I think sometimes we mislabel it as like, oh, I have OCD, I have to keep my kitchen clean, right? Let's talk about the diagnostic components of OCD. How are we understanding this diagnosis?
Sure. So OCD is really all about obsessions and compulsions. So those are the first two letters in OCD. The obsessions are really any kind of intrusive thought, image, or impulse that a person has that tends to be repetitive and it tends to be distressing. So for example, if somebody has a thought, I'm standing on the subway platform waiting for the train to come, and oh my gosh, I have a thought that I could just jump in front of the train. I don't want to jump in front of the train. I'm not suicidal. I don't want to die. But I had that thought that went through my mind. And now I am really anxious. I'm fearful. I'm really uncomfortable. I don't know what to do with myself. So now I want to engage in some kind of compulsion. So the compulsion, we can also use the word ritual here, but we're talking about anything that a person does either mentally or physically to try to bring down that level of distress. So I had that intrusive thought that freaked me out because I mean, who wants to have a thought about jumping in front of a train? I don't want to die. And I feel like I need to do something to control that. So I step back on the platform. I stand pressed up against the pole as much as I can so that I'm as far away from the edge and from the train as possible. Or I go upstairs and I wait somewhere else where I'm nowhere near the train. And now I have to wait there until the train actually comes. It's already in the station. And now I can get on and feel more secure and feel more safe. Or I pray in my head, God, please don't let me jump in front of that train. And so that reduces my anxiety because I feel like I have that connection. Or I count to 30, right? There's a million different things that I might do, but they're all in response to having had that initial intrusive thought and the discomfort that went along with it. So OCD is a cycle of having those types of repetitive intrusive thoughts. They can be in lots of different areas. So obviously we tend to think about the ones where like somebody is washing their hands or they have their closet color coded or things like that. But there's so many different types of presentations of OCD, but they all follow that same pattern where there's something that makes me uncomfortable because it's an intrusive experience. And then I do something either mentally or physically to try to bring down and relieve some of that anxiety.
And I think one of the things that you just mentioned, that idea of like, there's something that made me feel uncomfortable. So there's a component of this experience that there is this stress in there, right? If I don't do this, there is something that I am increasing in anxiety, increasing in distress. So we just highlight that a little bit because I think that's part of what differentiates this from I just need to keep my kitchen clean, right? Or I just can't stand when there's dirty shoes on the carpet. Like, what are some of the things that qualify this as distressing?
I think that's a really good point, right? Actually, I have a neighbor that will always say to me, like, but I'm still okay, right? Because she likes her house to be a certain way. As soon as, her family walks out the door from a party, she is cleaning immediately. She has all the dishes done. She, has stripped the linens and done everything and taking care of everything. And she's like, but I'm still okay, right? And the reason she's still okay and what differentiates it from OCD is because yes, she does prefer to have it that way. It does feel nice to her when her house looks a certain way and everything is okay. But when her grandchildren are over and they are like tearing the house apart, she sits and she plays games with them and she's fine and the world doesn't end. When everybody leaves, she can go to sleep before she does the linens. If it's like late at night, it doesn't impact whether she can go to bed. It's not distressing to her in the way that it's actually impacting on her level of functioning. And
Okay.
that's really the differentiation. So this is when we always say, like, it's only a problem when it's a problem. So it's a problem when the distress becomes so severe that it's impacting on your functioning, on your ability to be a student or to be a parent or to be a worker. When
Mhm.
it is impacting on the discomfort that you feel in such a distressing way that you're feeling awful throughout the course of the day more often than not, that's
Right.
when it becomes a problem. So it's really about kind of the distress and the impairment.
So thinking about that distress could be something like my heart is pounding, I'm starting to
Mhm.
sweat, I won't go to the train station because what if I have that scary thought about jumping in front of the train, right? Or
Exactly.
I have to run upstairs, I keep missing the train because by the time I can run down the stairs, I've missed access to the train because I couldn't stand standing on the platform. It was too overwhelming for me, or I can't think of anything else other than the fact that I keep having this scary thought about jumping in front of the train, right?
Totally. Yep.
All of the above. Okay. So in shift, and just in terms of like where this tends to present, how often do you see it in children?
So it definitely presents in kids. And so the kids that present with OCD, there's oftentimes a family history of anxiety or OCD as well. And so in terms of numbers, I mean, even with adults, we're talking about a small percentage of the population. We're talking about, depending on the study, somewhere between like 2 and 10% of the population typically are the folks who present with OCD. And so with kids, it's an even smaller number than that. So we're talking about less than 1% of the population presents with OCD. My numbers
Okay.
always feel skewed because working in anxiety disorder clinics, these are the folks that we see day in and day out. But
Right.
taking that step back and recognizing that it's really a small percentage of the population.
But when you see the adults in the population that you're working with, you tend to notice that they've actually been presenting with symptoms much younger that were missed.
It's pretty common. So especially for women, because I know that part of our focus today is really talking about, women who are experiencing an increase in OCD symptoms after childbirth. And it's really for women, there oftentimes is kind of a space from when they're, I'm going to say like 12 to 16, might be a first presentation of OCD. And then a second area might be 22 to 32, which is why it's so frequent in women after when they're in those childbearing years to begin with, because that's a prime peak time for women especially to be experiencing OCD symptoms. But it is very frequent that people will say, oh, I've had some of these symptoms since I was a kid. Oftentimes as kids, they look a little bit different. So they might have more magical thinking. If I line up my toys in a certain way, then my mommy's going to be okay. Or if I eat all of my food in a certain way, then nobody's going to rob my house. There's like certain magical things that might tend to go with it. That can happen in adults as well. And obviously kids could have other, more common adult presentations. But oftentimes there are things that people did when they were a kid that they no longer do, but now there are newer symptoms when they're an adult.
Okay. And so what we understand about perinatal mood disorders that we know that again, it's not a spectrum of disorder. It's just these unique features that show up in the postpartum and often in the pregnant period. One of those is perinatal OCD. And
Mhm.
we know that it's not like caused by pregnancy, but it creates like and it's not specifically hormonal as much as it is a vulnerability, that there's this vulnerable time after a person gives birth that creates a vulnerability towards the expression of some of these diagnoses. So let's focus in on women who have just given birth, and sometimes we'll say that we'll hear that it will have begun to escalate in pregnancy as well. But with the focus on postpartum, talk to me a bit about how OCD looks when we're talking about the postpartum woman.
Yeah, so for a lot of situations, and if we get to talk about scrupulosity later, which is more of a religious OCD, it's the same kind of idea where it's very much, it's not that the person might not have had OCD otherwise, it's just that this becomes the focus, the area in which they're really concerned. So you take somebody who is postpartum, and oftentimes it is focused in on the baby. So in that context, we're talking about somebody who might be concerned that they are going to poison their child. Again, certainly not because they want to, so a little bit different than a woman who might have like a postpartum psychosis. But it's not that they want to, it's just that they have an intrusive thought. If I'm mixing the formula for my baby, maybe the bleach that's under my sink also somehow got in there and is going to harm the baby. Or it is that maybe I'm going to, I had a woman that I treated who was always concerned that when she was holding her baby, she was going to want to like choke her baby to death, or that she would drop her baby over the railing in her house, over the banister from the second floor to the first floor, or that she might otherwise smother her baby. And again, these were all the same type of intrusive thoughts, exactly the same as if she was standing on the train platform and had a thought that I'm going to jump in front of that train. But all of a sudden, when these thoughts are related to your newborn, it is extremely upsetting and distressing to a new mother to have those types of thoughts.
Right. And then I also think about how sometimes that thought can almost sound protective, right? It comes from a space of, I think a lot of it comes from a space of, I care so deeply about this little person, and I'm supposed to care so deeply about this little person. What kind of mother would have these kind of thoughts is one perspective. And the other perspective is almost like my brain going into overdrive around how am I going to protect this child from harm. But one of the things I want to, right? Like one of the things I want
That
to
sense
bring
of
up also,
responsibility, right?
sense of responsibility.
I think that is a very frequent theme within OCD, things that I am responsible for, which of course, what's bigger than your newborn baby, things that I'm responsible for now become really overwhelming because I want to be able to protect against everything. And of course, that's actually just a total impossibility.
Right. And then that idea, I think it's always fascinating to me is I want to differentiate between these two threads of what if I drop my baby and what if I throw my baby are
Correct.
both components. Like it's not just like, well, I'm going to, and I think that also feels like, well, what if I drop my baby feels more normal, right? Then what if I throw my baby down the stairs? But really they're both an intrusive thought.
Absolutely. And the reality is, I mean, of course, anybody could be walking down the stairs with their baby and slip or fall or trip or, right? I mean, things can happen. And when somebody has that intrusive thought, then they become much more concerned about every move that they make because they really feel like that danger is around the corner, right? If a mom that doesn't have OCD recognizes that all of these things are possibilities, but doesn't really expect them to happen. They could, but you don't really expect it on any kind of regular basis. A mom with OCD about these thoughts is constantly waiting for that to happen and expecting it every time I pick up my baby is another opportunity for me to either throw or drop my baby.
Right. I've seen like the mom that it may be within the spectrum of non-disorder would say, okay, so I'm going to just hold my baby a little bit tighter as I walk down the stairs, right? Or I'm going to stay away from the open, unlocked, non-barred window. But when it becomes a diagnosis and becomes such a significant area of distress, the things that would be considered normal, like I'm not going to carry my baby up and down the stairs because of the risk of threat. And that
Exactly.
is what holds them back from like date. And that's the idea of impacting daily functioning, right?
Absolutely. And, I think that one of the things that happens is that that's part of what makes it a little bit tricky, both in a religious context at times and certainly in a perinatal context as well. We're talking about it being a very natural response to be a little more nervous about this, right? This is not, I mean, you watch how nervous people get with their new car, let alone your brand
Right.
new baby, right? And
Right.
so when people see new parents who are, oh, no, you have to wash your hands before you could hold the baby. Oh, no, you have to, I don't really feel comfortable with any child younger than 16 holding the baby or whatever. They're making, they're having these different rules and stuff. And everybody goes, like they're just nervous or they're first time parents
New
or
moms, right?
whatever, new moms, and nobody really thinks of these things as a big deal, and people can pretty easily miss um, the intensity with which this might be becoming a real OCD experience. for the person.
Right. And I think that actually one of the things I found so confusing for people who suffered or struggled with OCD with COVID, right? Because there was a component of like, wash your groceries. I had a client who said to me, she's like, I have been training for this my whole life. I know how to wash my Amazon boxes, right? And we joked about it, but she also acknowledged that like, how am I going to manage my OCD when there actually is a real threat of illness, but we don't really know where it's coming from? So just recognizing the complexity of that protective nature of wanting to keep my baby safe, and then measuring that up against, well, where does it become impacting my functioning?
Absolutely. And that's where, I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of times it can be really helpful for someone's support system to be able to step in and say, hey, I'm noticing these things. They seem like, right, it seems like it's really actually very distressing to you. And I don't think you're having that opportunity to be as happy about having this new baby as you
right,
could, right?
right.
Let's think about this.
And I think that that's where you bring up also that idea of when we talk about it's causing distress, these individuals are very overwhelmed by these thoughts and feelings, and they're not happy. They're
No.
not finding joy in the parenting, in this experience. It's a very painful and overwhelming experience for them. Um, so in thinking about the perinatal population, knowing that we have presentation of OCD as a pretty, like you said, it comes very much under, almost like underrated, underdiagnosed,
Very
because it
true.
can look like good parenting. Let's talk a bit about treatment. Like, what are the things that we know about OCD that helps in from a treatment perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the gold standards of treatment for OCD, they're really, I mean, there's medication options, which can be trickier in the perinatal period, especially if someone is nursing. That those are really something. I mean, we're very fortunate that I think in the Philadelphia area, we have lots of professionals that work that are familiar with treating, especially like females in perinatal work, which is really helpful in terms of thinking about medication options. But the gold standard of therapy for OCD is exposure and response prevention. So it's really exactly what it sounds like. So exposure to the things that someone is afraid of, and response prevention, meaning that when you do the exposure, it's really necessary to also stop the rituals that are associated with it, because it's actually the rituals that kind of keep it going. So if the exposure is going to be to touch something that I'm concerned is contaminated, and then I go wash my hands, I've really kind of defeated the point of having gone through and touched that thing in the first place. So not only do I have to touch the thing I think is contaminated, I also have to stop myself from going and running to wash my hands or Purelling my hands instead, right? It's not like I can just substitute, sort of a lesser ritual for it. I have to really allow myself to truly sit with my contaminated hands. So when we think about that in the context of perinatal OCD, the treatment really is exactly the same. So if I'm concerned that I am going to, that I could just harm my baby in some way, I've had patients in my office holding their babies and holding knives, right? Because honestly, we've all had to make dinner with one hand at some point in our motherhood careers. And the fear that I might just take this knife and stab my baby is so strong. We have to literally do that. Hold the baby, hold the knife.
Yeah.
I've had people that have, they stand with their kids at the top of the steps with their babies for like minutes and minutes and minutes, right? We usually recommend that when we're doing exposures like this, that they last for 30 to 45 minutes in order for the person to really kind of be able to have that experience where they recognize that they can tolerate it and handle it. And so when they're standing there, being able to know, like, hey, I've stood here for 40 minutes. It's not just that I didn't drop the baby, right? It's good for my brain to recognize that as well. It's also that I tolerated the discomfort that I felt from standing here having that intrusive thought. I tolerated all the discomfort that came with it. I didn't have to hold my baby extra tightly. I mean, I hold my baby normally, right? I'm still holding my baby in a secure way because we're certainly not looking to do anything that actually puts anyone in danger, but I'm holding my baby in a regular way. And not only did I not drop the baby, but I also I lived through it. I lived through
Right.
it to tell the tale. I didn't have to do any of the rituals that I used to do. I'd have to stand here and pray. I didn't have to have my husband take the baby down the stairs.
Right. Because what we know is that as time progresses, that 30, 40 minutes, if they're mindful of what's happening internally in their internal systems, they're noticing that actually the distress levels come down. that
Correct.
over time that the stress level comes down. And so they're noticing like, I didn't die, I didn't throw up, I didn't pass out. I mean, they may, but they'll come back and then they'll be okay. And they'll notice that they survived the intensity of the exposure and knowing that it will be okay on the other side.
Well, and
Right.
every time that we do an exposure like that, right? So we tend to do these things not just once, but more than once, because
Right.
every time that you do them, it gives your brain more opportunities for learning that nothing bad actually happened and that I could handle it, which is really honestly the key, right? There are certain things
Right.
that, with OCD, we can't even disprove it because it's such like, it's not a clear thing. I mean, when we talk about religious stuff, I can't disprove that I'm going to hell. How can I
Right.
disprove that?
Right.
We're not
Right.
always looking to be able to disprove an idea. Sometimes it's really helpful to learn that I stood here and I didn't actually stab my baby. But it's also helpful to know, well, I guess I still could the next time, right? It's not that it's off the table as in the realm of possible outcomes. It's just helped me to recognize that it's not
Right.
likely to happen and
So
that either way I can
yeah.
handle it.
Okay, so I want to introduce one. I want to walk into the scrupulosity
Sure.
piece for a minute, but I do also want to acknowledge that there are, I really would like to encourage anybody who is interested in getting care or treatment for OCD, make sure that you're seeing someone who is actually trained in OCD and EXRP, exposure and response therapy. This is a very specific modality of training that should only be done, in my opinion, by somebody who's taken a training and how to do it. I'm not saying you have to be certified per se, but it has to be somebody that has done extensive training in it and hopefully even get supervision in it as well. In moving this idea of how OCD presents, and especially in talking about perhaps a religious woman or a Jewishly religious woman, let's introduce that term scrupulosity. I love that term. I
Sure.
think it comes from like a Catholic
Well, it's Latin.
perspective. It's
Yeah.
Latin. And
Mhm.
let's talk about that. How do you see this presenting in the religious woman?
So scrupulosity, the word itself, you're right, it does come from a Latin word scrupulum, which means sort of a sharp stone. And it's kind of this idea that it's like this sharp stone on your conscience. It's like weighing on you. It's stabbing at you, right? I like to think about it like
Hmm.
literally as if you have like a rock in your shoe and it's just nagging at you and bothering you and bothering you and bothering you. And that's kind of what scrupulosity is about. It's really, we now use it as a word for religious-based or spirituality-based OCD. And it's kind of that there's something nagging at your conscience. And so with a religious Jewish woman, right? So again, I just want to be clear that it's not that we think that because somebody is religious, that that is why they have OCD, right? I think there's very much a common misconception that in any sort of like rule-bound religion, oh, well, that's why the person has this OCD. And of course, we don't in any way, there's no research that shows that that's true. But the same way that when you are perinatal and, you have this baby and you like, it's really important to you and it's the prime focus of your life, is the same way that when you are a more observant person and religion is a really important focus of your life, that your OCD symptoms are going to present themselves in that context. So OCD often really grabs at the things that are most important in someone's life, which is part of what makes it so distressing. So for a religious Jewish woman, some of the common areas where we might see scrupulosity present themselves are things related to keeping kosher, to kashrus, things related to taharas mishpacha,
The laws
which
of family purity.
exactly. Thank you. Right. So those are the two big ones, but oftentimes it's also things that are related to praying. So wanting to pray in an exact way. It might be somebody that is taking an extremely long time when they're doing their prayers. It's also somebody who might have doubts as to whether they did certain things. So when they're, ending the Sabbath, if they certain words that you might say to end the Sabbath, they feel like, oh, maybe I didn't really say it. They might wind up saying it again and again and again because they don't feel secure and don't feel comfortable ending the Sabbath. There could be things about honoring your parents is kind of an important one. Making vows, people being afraid that they swore about something and I swore that I was going to do this and then I didn't do it. And that can happen in so many different contexts. People that think that they're actually like making vows all throughout the day, every time that they do have a thought, it was a vow that now they're responsible for.
Mm.
So there's just lots of different ways in which it can present itself, but definitely the laws of family purity and rules related to dietary restrictions are the most common.
And I think that's really interesting. One of the things I think about when it comes to like the prayer perspective, I think we've often highlighted, look how beautifully she prayed, like look how beautifully she davened. Like it's so lovely to see how much concentration she has. But the thing that I want to remind us about is that idea of like it is distressing to them, right? That ability that they're not just like having this beautiful concentration and are communing with God. They're saying it again and again, or slowly enough, or repeating words because they're anxious about the fact that they may not have gotten the word right. And if they
Yeah.
didn't get the word right, is there a consequence to that? Is there a punishment? Or I just have to do it again? So it's not like they finish prayer and they say, oh, I feel so connected to God now. It's I finish prayer and they say, do I need to do it again? And that was so hard. And they're late to work or they're late to class because they didn't get it right and had to do it again and again and again. I think that's one of the things when we talk about mikvah or the laws of family purity, where there's a lot of ritual and a lot of rules related to it. When somebody has OCD, I think this is just like a kind of a PSA to the community. Make sure that you are being guided by someone who is knowledgeable about OCD, either a mikvah attendant or a rabbi, a yoetzet halacha, somebody who is religiously knowledgeable around these issues, but also mental health knowledgeable, that they are able to differentiate for us between this is somebody who just wants to get it right because they're starting out in their newly married life and they want to get it right and get it done well, versus someone who is really kind of feeding into that OCD nature diagnosis that either it's been had or not been diagnosed yet. Any other pieces of that you want to make sure to highlight here?
Well, it's interesting because recently you and I were both at a conference that was related to training mikvah attendants and being able to know how to probably properly address these things within their roles. And so one woman came over to me and said, "Well, I'm just slow." Right? I just take a long time when I do certain things. I'm not distressed by it. It doesn't bother me. I look at, my mikvah time as a time where I can relax. I'm like, really, I can just take the time that I need. And she said, I'm just as slow making a pan of chicken, right? Like I'm just slow, but that's fine, right? And that's great.
Right.
And so sometimes we have to really understand and help the person to be able to think about what's the cause for this, because either you just took a bath for 2 hours and you loved it and you thought it was great and you put some bubbles in there, right? And you really allowed yourself to relax and enjoy, or you spent 2 hours in the bathtub and the whole time you were stressing every single moment about, did the water actually hit every part of my body? Right. So if you were in there for 2 hours and you're really unsure about whether the water got everywhere that it was supposed to, or whether when you were washing yourself, you hit every single inch, that's a whole different ball game if that distress is happening at the same time with those intrusive thoughts and it's bothersome to you. So we want to ask people, we don't want to just assume that because somebody is taking a long time that that OCD is the issue.
Right.
We want to have a better understanding what it is, but we do want to have in our minds that that's a real possibility.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that I come back to when we talk about like the COVID influence, where we had, I remember one of in the OCD training that I did on EXRP, one of the things they said was when they were dealing with a client with a diagnosis already, they said once the pandemic had, kind of slowed down, or we were aware that we were kind of returning to some level of normal, cleaning behaviors, I guess you could say, or non-ritualistic behaviors, the clients were being told, we go by the CDC guidelines. So if the CDC says you wash your hands according to happy birthday, you cannot wash your hands longer than that.
Correct.
And I think that, right, and I think sometimes when talking about mikvah, it's the same idea that the rabbi or the mikvah attendant is guiding you. This is how long you're allowed to bathe. This is how long you check your hands. That this is how long, and anything outside of that responsibility is where we deal with it from an OCD perspective. And that, yes. Yeah.
I would add one thing to that, to say that, so there are really great guidelines that have been written up over time. There's a really wonderful book. You can buy it on Amazon from Rabbi David Kaufman out of Lakewood that is focused on treating. It's a workbook for women that have OCD related to family purity. But what is important is not just the timing, right? What I was going to say is that book provides some guidelines, like when you are taking a shower, it should be no longer than this amount of time. When you're doing this, combing your hair should be no more than this amount of time. And that's really helpful. And at the same time, the goal is really to do it not incorrectly, but to do it maybe not to the point that you feel like it's absolutely right. Because quite honestly, I mean, when women don't have OCD, that's really what they're doing, right? I'm following the guidelines. I'm brushing my teeth. I am taking off my makeup. I'm cleaning my earring holes. Like I'm doing all the things on the list, but I'm not worried about whether or not they're absolutely correct. I believe that I did what I did. And then I'm
Right.
moving on and I'm going home and I'm done for the day. Right. And so that's really the difference is we also want people not just to follow a specific time guideline, but to be doing things in a way that doesn't feel as definite as the way that they've been trying to feel in the past.
And isn't that idea of like that there is a part of me that can never know, right? It's the same thing of the general OCD, the perinatal population. The part of me that can never know if this will ever happen to my child or if I'm getting it 100% right. That like doubt component of like knowing that there's a part of this that I may not get right all the time, and to be accepting and gentle to myself and my thoughts and behaviors relating to that experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Jonathan Grayson's main book, which is Freedom from OCD, being able to tolerate uncertainty, it's all about that, right? There's so many areas of our lives where we have no choice but to really tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing. I mean, I really don't know that when I go pick up my kids from school that I'm going to make it there because driving a car is actually really dangerous, right?
Right.
The
Right.
likelihood of something happening while
Right.
driving is much higher than some of the things that people with OCD worry
Yeah.
about, and yet they get in the car all the time. So
Yeah.
they're tolerating the uncertainty in some areas because it doesn't occur to them. They're not thinking about it every day, as most of us are not. But yet, okay, they could acknowledge that that's a thing if they have to. It's
Right.
really the same in the areas that their OCD is focused. So I have to
Right.
really tolerate that there's no way for me to know. Right.
Right.
I have a woman that I've been working with, with issues related to mikvah, who is really concerned about covering every single inch of her body when she is cleaning herself. I mean, to the point where, uh, all kinds of like physical maneuvers to try to access places that I'm sure most women don't worry about when they are, when they're preparing. And so that being said, really helping her to recognize that it's the same thing. We have to really tolerate the uncertainty here about whether you literally got every millimeter.
Right, right. And I think the one thing I'd like to kind of finish off this after this conversation with is this idea of this tolerating uncertainty and also making sure that I am well supported in this process, making sure that I can beginning to understand a little bit of the differences between what is just an intrusive thought versus what is actually full blown OCD. Because I
Yep,
think that it's normal to have, or a component of normal postpartum in particular, to have these scary thoughts about what will happen to my baby or what if something
absolutely.
happens to me, because we definitely will see OCD presentation or just that, let's just call them scary thoughts for now, or those
Sure.
intrusive thoughts show up about me. Maybe I'm sick. What if I get sick? What if something happens to
Yep.
me?
Yep.
And so the difference to me, and correct me if you see differently, the difference to me is the idea that an intrusive thought in a person who does not have OCD, it's not as sticky. It doesn't
That's
stick
exactly
in
the
my
word I
brain.
was going to use. Yep.
Okay.
Sticky. Hmm.
So it's like it kind of imagine it going in one ear. Oh, that's a crazy thought. Okay, and then I can release it and say I'm okay. Like I just went on the train. It's so funny you bring up that train platform idea. I was just standing at the train platform and the train's coming, and I'm thinking, should I back up? Am I too close? Am I? But then the minute I took one step back, because I was like, yeah, maybe I'm too close to the tracks. One step back, and then I wasn't worried anymore. Right? I didn't have any overlying concern. Maybe I should back up further and further and further. Right? For me, I was more concerned about somebody pushing me onto the tracks than I was back. I don't know. That was my intrusive thought. But like we all have intrusive thoughts when we're driving down a
Absolutely.
highway behind the car carriers, and there's all those trucks and cars and what happens if those
Mhm.
cars loosen up and fly back onto my car, right? Those things are normal, but the idea is like, okay, I'm just gonna change lanes and move along with my life. I'm not like sweating and panicking.
Or not. Half the time I just stay there, right? Like half
Right.
the time I don't even do anything. It's just a thought that came and it went. I didn't even do anything. Sometimes I do, and it's not a big
Right.
deal. But many times I don't even do
Sometimes
anything
not.
in response to them.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the idea of being able to label, to say, oh, that's an intrusive thought. Oh, that's a scary thought, but I'm actually okay and I'm managing my life and we're going to move along. I'd love to mention the book also, Scary Thoughts by Karen Kleiman. It's one of my more favorite books. She's put out several others at this time as well, co-authored in many ways, but with Hillary Waller. She was very involved in the writing of those books. Just really a good, kind of physical presentation for the layperson around OCD and OCD thoughts. Okay, and finishing up today, 3 misconceptions around OCD that you want to tell the world.
That, you know, it's not all fun and games, right? So meaning that I think a lot of times people laugh at people that they think have OCD if they see somebody walking funny, doing something funny, washing the dishes in a different way, and really recognizing the, if somebody really does have OCD, the potential for the distress and the pain that the person is going through. So, you know, somebody told me yesterday that somebody had written like kept a notebook with like quirky things Bob did or something like that. Well, it's really not freaking funny, right? Because the person
Yeah.
really is experiencing so much daily distress, and it wasn't just quirky, it was really a very intense experience for this patient. So that's
Mm.
really number one. I think, you know, number two is that I would want people to know that there's really wonderful treatment out there. So people think when they're seeing somebody who's suffering so much and in so much pain, or maybe has been dealing with this for a really long time. And unfortunately, we know that it often takes a really long time for somebody to get to really good treatment. I'm so glad you mentioned earlier about the importance of seeing somebody who's really an expert in this particular kind of work, because it is so specific. And there is really, really good treatment out there. IOCDF, which is the International OCD Foundation, iocdf.org is a great website, can really also lead people to being able to find providers in their area that provide this kind of treatment. With the advent of PsyPact, which is like a national system where psychologists are able to practice in lots of various states across the country, there's really like it's improved access for remote care with people who are specialists in this area. So keep looking until you find the right person, because the right person is out there that actually knows how to provide treatment and good treatment for OCD. And what else? Third misconception. I guess it's really just a normalization of this experience, right? So I think you're right that everybody experiences intrusive, distressing, scary thoughts at times. OCD just means that some of those thoughts get stuck, and that they are more specific and they stay with you, and that they become distressing and lead into a cycle and a pattern. But there's so many people out there that have OCD. And so really from the very beginning of treatment, that is like one of my biggest jobs as a therapist, is to really normalize the experience, because people really feel like these things are weird and they're crazy. And who has thoughts that they could stab their baby? Like, what kind of mom has those thoughts? Or, you know, it's really scary to people. And so being able to, from that very beginning, recognize, and so support groups can be helpful for that, to be able to normalize that experience. Getting a good therapist can be helpful in terms of normalizing that experience, but just recognizing that, you know what, these thoughts happen. It doesn't mean that there is something wrong with you.
Excellent, excellent. Alyssa, thank you. Thank you for
My
spending
pleasure.
time in your day and talking to us in such a concrete and I think very manageable way. I know that people will learn very much from what we just talked about together.
Yeah, thank you
So
so
thank
much
you
for having
again.
me.
Absolutely.